Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we introduce our Environment Roundtable segment with a discussion of climate change in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. Our guests are Darryl Fears, a reporter for the Washington Post, who focuses on the Chesapeake Bay region and national wildlife. Bob Deans, Associate Director of Communications for the Natural Resources Defense Council. Bob is a former president of the White House Correspondents Association and the author of the book, The River Where America Began, A Journey Along the James. And joining us from Ohio University is Geoff Dabelko, a professor and director of environmental studies who also serves as a senior advisor to the Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I want to begin with the bottom line. Has the climate change discussion changed in reaction to Hurricane Sandy? Darryl, let's begin with you.
You see a little movement among state officials and among environmental groups. People are talking about a number of things after Sandy, in particular protections against for the shoreline, building of structures to stop the water and deal with sea level rise. And we talked earlier about a study by 47 climate scientists or satellite scientists who mapped how the polar ice is melting and how that contributes to sea level rise. And that got a lot of attention because the thing about sea level rise is that it can make storms like Sandy a lot more powerful in contributing to wave energy that inundates shorelines. And so people are talking a lot about that now.
Bob, what's your thought?
Absolutely agree with Darryl. I mean, we had Hurricane Sandy killed more than 100 Americans. It's done in estimates up to as high as $100 billion in damage. It put 14 feet of water in lower Manhattan. That has never happened before. And remember, John, this is coming against the backdrop of what we just finished in October, the hottest 12-month period of its kind we've ever had in the United States. We had record heat across so many parts of the country this summer. We had our farmers and our ranchers losing more than half of their croplands and pasture lands. We had wildfires burning 9 million acres of our forest and fields. Against that backdrop of devastation and the ravaging impact of climate change, we have this Hurricane Sandy. This is the face of climate change. People understand it's now come out of the laboratory into our cornfields, into our backyards, into our cities. We have to do something about it.
And the sobering notion there, Bob, is that what you just described, this devastation, as you called it, is the so-called new normal. Geoff, what is your thought on this? Does this jumpstart the discussion, Hurricane Sandy?
Well, I think it certainly provides greater opportunity for discussion in that Darryl has an easier case to make to his editors for why writing stories that include a climate change component makes sense in having in American papers. It brings it home in ways that too often the notion was those who are really vulnerable to this problem are folks overseas, folks who don't have the wealth to build a higher seawall or to rebuild after a disaster. And so in this way, even in ways that Hurricane Katrina didn't do, the fact that it was the Northeast and the financial center of the country that took the big hit, I think that opens up a position for dialogue and pushes off what had been for some years essentially a discussion of, yes, there's climate change, no, there's not climate change, and in some ways a false sense of balance that is, of course, we want our media coverage to be balanced, but in this sense it really privileged the few who were kind of trying to raise questions from a political standpoint rather than a scientific standpoint and understanding. And then within climate, I think it allows for greater conversation for adaptation to climate change. How are we going to respond to the impacts? Much of the discussion has been framed as how do we mitigate the problem? How do we reduce the amount of carbon or the greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere? We need both of those conversations, but certainly adaptation, which has been generally left to the side or a lower priority, gets greater pride of place now.
Geoff mentions the political implications here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on this he said, she said stuff, but are we past that, or is this still something we're going to have to deal with?
I think what we saw in the election, and I'd like to hear Darryl's thoughts on this too, but we saw in the election that our politics is divided, but the country is not. The country is united around the need to do something about this climate problem. Remember, we had the clearest choice in history in this presidential election between one candidate who said climate change is a joke and another who said it's a threat to our future. And overwhelmingly, the country went for the guy who said this is a threat. That's what voters said in Ohio, in Virginia, in Florida, in Colorado, in Wisconsin. Across the country, in every genuine swing state in America, Americans went with the guy who said, this is a threat. We got to do something about it. We got to cut the carbon that's causing this problem.
And the unfortunate moment for Governor Romney is when he was mocking in his acceptance speech, and then Hurricane Sandy happens, and that really becomes unfortunate for candidate Romney.
Not only that, but he said that the states should be responsible for what FEMA does, and Sandy hit at the very moment that he almost said that, and so it made his comments look kind of ridiculous. But I wanted to pick up on something that Bob said, and that is that the momentum building up to Sandy, of what we were covering with the weird winter and the very warm spring, and the things that we covered leading to this event, from trees blooming and flowers blooming in the middle of December, and pests coming from nowhere, bees coming out of hibernation early, bats coming out of hibernation early, and dry conditions leading to fires that you mentioned. All of these things we wrote about, and that had a great effect on the public. That's one reason why the public was so behind Obama on this.
It sounds like almost science fiction, what you're all talking about, but unfortunately it's real. It's not science fiction. One question I have, though, is, look, an event happens and Americans react in a dramatic way. And we say that everything's changed now. We're going to talk about this in a way we haven't before. But what happened after Hurricane Katrina? There were discussions like this, and we went back to ignoring the issue. Why is this different, or do you have any expectation that this is different?
What?
Who would like? Geoff, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think part of what the Sandy experience allows for the discussion to expand to is a notion that we're not going to solve this problem just in what seems like a very remote process that in many ways people are already suspicious of, which is the all countries together. In fact, it's going on right now in Doha, coming together under the UN auspices to negotiate a global deal on reducing emissions. And so in some ways it expands the conversation so that people should be asking, and they are asking, their local water manager, what does this mean for me in terms of variability, in terms of will we have water? Will we have too little? Will we have too much? And so in some ways, I hope that it will also have the federal government paying more attention to where so much of this action is, where the rubber meets the road, which is on the ground. And so that's in localities and that's in states. A historical center for innovation and response to environmental problems, clean water, clean air. These were problems that were initially driven by localities and states. And so we need to remember that environmental history of how we made progress and then apply it to climate, which can seem very large and very diffuse. But some of these big storms, and it is important, of course, to caveat the challenges of attributing individual storms to climate change. And what we're really talking about, it's I think more helpful to think of it as climate change is going to exacerbate some of these challenges, perhaps make them more frequent and more intense in ways that are game changers, that push us over some thresholds and force us to address these challenges and understand that it is a new normal. And not just an episodic thing that is a short-term crisis that we can move on from.
You know, Geoff, something you just said there, and I know you're being intellectually honest when you say it, where we can't say with 100% certainty that this storm is a function of global warming or climate change, right? That's what you essentially said. But
well, I'm saying that it's not 100% attributable. Right. Part of it is there's multiple stresses. There are all sorts of, we have storms, right? We had storms before the Industrial Revolution. We started doubling the CO2 emissions level concentrations in the atmosphere. But it's a big accelerant to some of these problems and increasing the swings. and increasing the damage that can be done and putting us in new areas. And so it can be a false debate. Well, it's not a holy
that's what
climate,
I'm wondering.
and
Does
so
it
therefore we don't care.
Does it end up encouraging deniers by suggesting that there's wiggle room, that we can't attribute these disasters to an ongoing trend?
You know, basically the deniers now are the fossil fuel industry. That's what we're down to. Darryl's paper had a survey in August. 74% of the American people said it's time for us to do something about this. The University of Texas did its own survey. They came out with the very same number in October. The American people get it. The American people know we need to do something about it.
But some influential members of Congress are also part of that group of deniers. It's not just the fossil
Well,
fuels
if you look at, and we've done this, and you can connect the dots very, very quickly between the members of Congress who are saying, you know, this is a hoax, and the $1 million checks they're getting from the fossil fuel industry.
So indirectly, the fossil fuels industry is what you're saying, or directly?
It's their allies on Capitol Hill, and it breaks down very clearly along party lines, and you can look to the Center for Responsive Politics website and get all the numbers you want on that. But here's the important thing. American people want something done about this. We can do it. The NRDC put out a plan just this week. You can find it on nrdc.org that can do this at low cost, high benefit, in a way that lets states tailor a plan to their own energy mix. It lets consumers save big money on their electricity bills, and it lets the power companies find the most cost-effective way to hit the target.
Give us some details. What are some of the things that we can do, both small and large?
Well, let's talk about power plants, because power plants are 40% of the industrial carbon pollution in this country. Power plants can improve the efficiency of their existing plants, tune up those boilers, or add equipment to take the carbon out of those emissions before it gets into our atmosphere. They can shift their energy generation mix toward more carbon neutral ways of generating electricity, whether it's natural gas, wind, solar, anything like that. Finally, they can encourage energy efficiency, because our families can save $700 a year on average and reduce electricity demand, thereby reducing the carbon footprint of power plants by doing simple things like weatherizing their homes, using energy efficient light bulbs and appliances. That's big money. Those are big savings. And we can do this for an investment of about 1% of the electric utility industry's revenues annually. That's a good investment in our future.
Darryl and Geoff, if you could chime in on this too, on this notion of solutions. What are some of the things we can be looking at, both large and small? And also, lingering in the back of my mind is this question of, are we too late to avoid some of the implications of the atmosphere's warming?
I think that in urban areas in particular, you can invest in mass transportation, and so you can have a metro system that runs efficiently, unlike we have in Washington, D.C. But you can have that, and you can invest in buses, you can invest in trolleys. Norfolk, Virginia has an excellent trolley system that they just started there, where people can get around that very small city very efficiently on that. And so there are a number of ways that you can hook into wind energy now and have power that way. A number of churches and other institutions have begun that to just draw down that carbon use of power plants.
Geoff, back to the sort of framing device for our discussion, Hurricane Sandy, are there implications about what we need to be doing as far as things like coastal development as well?
Well, I think so. I mean, you saw this last week, an op-ed in the New York Times calling for a complete rethink and, in fact, a pullback from federal flood insurance, and saying, listen, if you're going to live in floodplains on the coast, you need to actually bear the true cost of that, as opposed to the federal taxpayers doing that. And so in that sense, I think there are institutional responses, rethinking how we have done things in the face of what it's going to be like in a warmer world. And then there are, and those are clearly big political decisions as well, but then there are also ones that, as Bob said, make financial sense, that are really just about asking different questions and things that are about building codes and how we think about building infrastructure in ways that can understand that we don't have the luxury of not paying attention to efficiency, and that there are in fact lots of ways that can save us money. And then also, I think finally, much of the discussion has been about how to increase supply or have the supply be greener. I think we also have to have a broader discussion of how can we in some sense, redefine the good life in ways that aren't so energy intensive. So we have to look at the demand side. And there are areas, even in behavioral psychology, I think, in some ways, we need to get past the thou shalt not consume and the lecturing and the finger pointing, and understand, how did we make big changes and look for analogous situations. A couple decades ago, it was seen as a big intrusion to be asked to wear your seatbelt. Now it's just a given. Norms changing around smoking. We're in the middle of norms changing around what foods we eat, what is responsible to give kids in the school. We need to look to a broader set of folks. We need the engineers, we need the lawyers, we need the scientists, but we also need the behavioral psychologists and the business community to understand why people choose to purchase and consume differently, to be part of the discussion.
Along those lines, that's interesting stuff about the behavioral modification. Part of the problem would seem to be when you talk about smoking, it's one thing, it's one activity, and you can link it directly to horrific health concerns. This is so diffused. There's so many little things. When you were all talking about things we can and should be doing, it wasn't one big thing. It was a number of things all patched together. Is that part of the difficulty of communicating this? Is that it's just all too diffuse?
Well, we clearly have to go after the big things. When power plants are responsible for 40% of the problem, we really do have to pay attention to how can we reduce that. That's why the NRDC plan calls for a 26% reduction by 2020. You're talking about more than 500 million tons a year of carbon. That's a big thing we can do. The president put in place a new program where we're going to cut in half the carbon pollution coming from our cars and trucks between now and 2025. Another big thing that gets done. At the personal level, people want to do something to make a contribution, and the more that consumers have a choice in the matter, the more they can make that choice. I got my bill the other day for my electricity, and I was given the option of paying 1 penny more per kilowatt hour to get all of my electricity provided by wind turbines. I checked the box.
And who's your provider?
Well, it's Pepco.
And is that a typical thing that is happening across the country, or is Pepco ahead of the curve?
They're probably ahead of the curve. I think we need to see more of that, but I was glad to see the option, and I think consumers around the country would be happy to have that option.
Yeah, I mean, you have local governments having programs where you can winterize your home at an incentive. You can get into programs that give you some type of bonus for doing that work. People are placing solar panels on their homes. They are getting energy efficient refrigerators and air conditioners and things like that. And there are local programs that do that, but I don't think enough of that is being done. And so how do you do that on a large scale? How do you get people to buy into, I think what Geoff said, are what is going to be the new luxury? How do you look at that? You walk into people's homes and it's freezing in there. Do they need that much air conditioning?
Well, one way I think traditionally that we've done that is create a movement with leadership. So maybe my final question, based on time remaining to all of you, is where's the leadership going to come from? Is anybody in this town willing to spend political capital on this problem, for example? What are your thoughts on that? Bob?
Well, certainly we're seeing leadership from President Obama. He recognized climate was a problem in 2008. He recognized it during the campaign in his convention speech. He recognized it in his victory speech on election night. So the president understands this problem. He's leading at home, he's leading abroad, and the rest of us need to understand and pay attention and listen and say, this is about our future. And remember, we're already paying the price for this pollution right now. We're paying for it in our farms, in our croplands, in our pastures, in our cities, in our floods, in our wildfires, in our droughts. We're paying the price. This is about rationalizing, it's about getting it right, it's about fixing this for our children.
It seems that they're setting a foundation for it. I think that you're not going to find a whole lot of leadership in the group of people who are in Washington now, but what type of momentum can you create for people who want to do this later on, for future leaders who want to tackle this problem, coming from whatever spectrum they come from. Young people are intensely interested in the environment and new energy, and they will probably lead on this in the future, but I think that you have to set the groundwork for them now if you want to get that started.
Thanks. And the gentleman from Ohio gets the final word, and with about 30 seconds to deliver it.
Terrific. Thank you, John. Well, I'd say since I am sitting on a university campus, I would second Darryl's point that young people have a lot of energy and a lot of expectations for their leaders on tackling this issue now. But I think in addition to the key federal leadership, I think we have to see that the folks who have to make those tough decisions day to day on the ground are where we will see innovation, where we will see leaders taking responsibility for the impacts because they're feeling it. And so that's local, state, and regional groupings. We shouldn't forget the regional efforts that are ongoing in climate change, and understanding that the private sector needs to be at the table, that the faith community has a strong component that is tackling these issues very seriously. And then even, as John knows, we at the Wilson Center spend a lot of time trying to understand the non-traditional focus of the military on these issues, energy and climate, and understanding that there are real opportunities for development and technology and pushing that forward, even under the dictates that they have of national security, that a lot of these steps make sense in that frame and are ones that we should learn from in the civilian sector as well.
Well, gentlemen, thank you for providing leadership and insight from this table this morning. Thanks for joining us. When we return, a look at what we might expect in the foreign policy arena during President Obama's second term. We'll be right back.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
Welcome back. With President Obama preparing to begin a second term in office, we asked Washington Post associate editor and columnist David Ignatius to provide context on what we can expect when it comes to foreign policy. Let's take a look. What does history tell us about second terms when it comes to foreign policy? How should we adjust our expectations?
Well, I think the rubric would be that in a second term, presidents don't have to be as attentive to domestic politics and interest groups, so it's easier to be more creative, more active in foreign policy. One issue that's historically been true about is Middle East peacemaking, and that's in part because strong pro-Israel pressure from organized groups in the U.S. is seen to be a limiting factor. So you saw President Clinton at the end of his second term being very aggressive. I've heard him say he wishes he had been more aggressive earlier on in his first term and gotten started early. So I think President Obama, when he thinks about his legacy, is going to think about Middle East peace, a key issue when he came in. He's also going to think about some kind of engagement with Iran, which he very much wanted to do in his first year in office, and he just got nowhere. He's going to think about ending the war in Afghanistan, something he embarked on without ever really being 100% confident in his policy. Yes, I mean, second terms. And the simple fact is that if President Obama can find a way to speak to the world more effectively and emphatically, be more of a forward-leaning global leader in his second term, he'll have more success. The reticence in the first term that we describe as leading from behind, a term the White House hates, and that's really got to change if he achieves what he wants to.
How likely is it that President Obama can set the agenda versus reacting to circumstances?
Well, part of being president is the process of reacting wisely to crises that arise really for reasons beyond your control. One of my favorite analysts of everything, Warren Buffett, the great American businessman, when asked once, "What's your strategy?" said, "My strategy is to answer my phone." In other words, my strategy is to respond to the things that come at me. And I think that President Obama needs to strike a balance between responding effectively to the things that are coming at him. Iran is coming at him. Iran is moving toward having nuclear weapons capability, actually building a nuclear weapon, we fear. So he's got to find a way to resolve that through diplomacy, or he is on a path toward what he has said will be a policy of prevention, including prevention by military force. So he's on a path toward the possibility of military conflict with Iran. Got to deal with that. He has a problem coming at him with Syria. The government of Bashar al-Assad is falling apart. What's going to replace it? How's he going to organize U.S. policy for that? He's got to deal with that. That's not a matter of choice. Same thing with Afghanistan. The U.S. RID is running out. He said our troops are going to come home. How are we going to keep stability there? How are we going to help Afghanistan avoid falling right back into a civil war? Which we saw led to the birth of al-Qaeda and the threat to the United States. Those problems are coming at him. Other ones he'll try to define, but those are the ones he just has to deal with.
Is lame duck syndrome as much a factor in foreign policy as it can be when it comes to domestic issues?
Well, the president's authority as commander-in-chief continues until the day he leaves office, and that extends across the range of power, open military power, covert action through the CIA, all of the tools, instruments of executive power, and so there's less of the lame duck phenomenon, I think, in foreign policy than in domestic. President Clinton was quite effective as a Middle East peacemaker. Almost got to the finish line at the end of his second term in 1990 or 2000, but didn't get across. It wasn't a diminution of authority that led to that. It was other problems.
Does the United States need a grand strategy, and is agreement on what that might be possible at this time?
Well, I think the United States does need a grand strategy, and I think the president is groping toward one, but we know some of the basics. First, the president felt strongly when he came into office that the United States needs to operate through international institutions and with the support of allies. He felt that really the biggest national security problem the U.S. had under President George W. Bush was we were too unpopular in the world. We'd separated ourselves from the United Nations, other organizations. So he has sought very specifically to rebuild those alliances. When you travel overseas, you find President, popular as he was in winning an election victory here at home, is more popular in many parts of the world. So that's part of his strategy, reconnecting the United States to its traditional allies and then dealing with the new emerging countries that will be allies. I think he's made clear in what's described as his pivot toward Asia that in terms of fundamental strategy, he wants to end the concentration that marked all of the years after 1945 on the transatlantic alliance, often to the exclusion of other areas, and pivot toward a greater focus on Asia, where a rising China will be the dominant factor and potentially the dominant rival for the United States for the rest of this century. I think he has other strategic ideas. To mention a final one, I think President Obama believes that he can, through wise policy, help bend the radical Islamic forces away from violence, as was expressed most dangerously through al-Qaeda, towards politics, toward democratic politics where Islamic parties run and are elected, as in Egypt and Tunisia, but are no longer throwing bombs and shooting guns, but are operating through the ballot box. I know President Obama says if I could accomplish that, help that turn, that would be part of a grand strategic concept and achievement.
New editions of Context can be found each week at wilsoncenter.org/context. That's all for this week's edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.